Okay, now I'm going to show selected examples from Middle Byzantine art and just essentially one image from later Byzantine art. Sometimes called the Second Golden Age, from 867 to 1204, and then I'm going to show you a slightly later image. Then I'm going to show you a later image as well, Middle Byzantine to Late Byzantine. In 843, the Council of Constantinople ended the iconoclastic controversy. This meant that there was rebuilding of the churches, and there was a lot of redecorating, and that there was new art created. We have a period from 867 to 1056, sort of late 9th through a little more than the first half of the 11th century, so 10th century plus and minus. That's called the Macedonian Renaissance, in which a lot of art is created. Some of the emperors are Basil I, Leo VI, Constantine VII, and then there is also the period that is called the Comnenian period, from 1081 to 1185. The reason it ends, the reason this golden age ends in 1204 is that is the date of the Fourth Crusade, when Western Crusaders were welcomed into Constantinople, and they looked around and said, wow, this place is really wealthy. Why should we go all the way to Jerusalem? Why not just sack Constantinople? And of course, that is the sack of Constantinople of 1204. It's also where the famous line, kill them all, God will know his own, comes from. It's like, how can we tell? You know, some of them are Christians, and some of them are not. You know, we're supposed to kill the non-believers. It says, kill them all, God will know his own. So that was obviously a horrible period for Constantinople. Some of the things about the architecture would relate to the elaborate Byzantine liturgy. As we've mentioned before, the Mass would be hidden from the lay people behind the iconostasis, or the what we might call a choir screen in the West. But it would be a screen that was essentially a wall of icons and would prevent the lay people from seeing the great mystery of transubstantiation, or the mystery of changing the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. While they were hearing the Mass, the lay people were supposed to meditate on images. What we're going to do now is talk about the mosaics that were created in Hagia Sophia after iconoclasm. And of course, we're going to look at some things from different centuries as they go on. We've already looked at the image of the Madonna and Child enthroned that was created directly after the end of iconoclasm. And we'll see other things that were created in subsequent centuries. One thing I can't show you is the original image of Christ in the dome. We know that the dome once contained an image of Christ as all creator, or Pantocrator. And we're going to see images of Christ Pantocrator in other domes by other later Byzantine churches. When you see these, you'll see that they will remind you of that icon of Christ that we saw from around 700 at the monastery of St. Catherine on Mount Sinai. Very similar physiognomy of Christ, blessing, holding a book. But of course, in mosaic, the images become more linear and more abstracted. But of course, we don't have that image anymore. When the Ottoman Turks conquered Constantinople in 1453, they took over the Church of Hagia Sophia and converted it into an Islamic mosque. At that time, you either destroyed the Christian figural mosaics or you whitewashed them. And because they whitewashed some of them in some of the peripheral areas, we have them today. When it became a museum, they took off the whitewash and were able to were able to look at some of the surviving images. However, when you look up into the dome, those are Islamic mosaics, so they wouldn't relate to what the post-iconoclastic Christians would have been putting up. However, here we see in a lunette over the main entrance to the narthex, one of these Macedonian emperors, Leo VI, making proskynesis before Christ. And of course that is a prostration. He's literally getting down on his knees, really getting down on the floor, getting down on the ground in front of Christ. And this dates from around 900. Now, I should explain that gesture. In the West, when we think about approaching a king, for example, you might bow. Or today, if you were approaching, say, Queen Elizabeth and you were a British subject, you might curtsy if you were female. Now, that shows respect. But in the Byzantine Empire, you had to do a lot more. If you were approaching the emperor, you would have to get down on your hands and your knees and put your put your forehead down on the ground. And so here we're seeing the emperor making that same gesture, that same pose of proskynesis, which is really just prostrating yourself in front of, in this case, the emperor himself prostrates himself in front of God, in front of Christ. We also see Christ in the center of the lunette, very large. We see the emperor down on his knees. We see roundels with Mary and an angel on either side of Christ. And the background, of course, is gold. What you're seeing, and remember, you'll be seeing this as you walk into the church, is the investiture of divine wisdom. Remember, Hagia Sophia means holy wisdom or divine wisdom, and it refers to Christ himself, that he is the holy wisdom. So Christ, who is holy wisdom, is giving his imperial authority to the emperor. So the emperor is prostrate before Christ, but he's also, above everybody else, because God himself, Christ himself, has given him that authority to rule on earth. And we might look a bit at the style. Once again, you're seeing much more linear figures, which make them really stand out. And the drapery folds are becoming very linear. At the same time, there's still this suggestion of foreshortened knees, except they do look sort of flattened. So here we're really seeing, I think, Byzantine linearity. The roundels of the Virgin Mary and the angel are believed to be a kind of abbreviated annunciation, the angel being the angel Gabriel. And so this refers to the incarnation of Christ. And there was, Leo had a homily or sermon for the Feast of the Annunciation in which Christ, as holy wisdom, was related to the emperor as Christ's regent on earth. The emperors saw themselves as ruling for Christ on earth, that they were the vicars of Christ. They were the regents for Christ. So they had virtually unlimited power. A little bit later, late 10th century, we see an image of the Virgin and child enthroned. And you'll see that it looks very, very, very much like the image that would have also been able to be seen above the altar in the conch of the apse, which we've already seen that 9th century image. It's a little bit of abbreviated. Christ has moved his legs a bit. The cushion seems to have only one poof, but it's exactly the same iconographic type. And here we see on either side of Christ and Mary, Constantine I and Justinian I, the emperors, these very important emperors, offering their city and their church, as we'll see, to Christ. Let's look a little closer. There you see the Virgin Mary. So here you see a detail of the Virgin Mary. And here you see details of the emperors. Justinian is on our left, and you can tell you could read it, but also if you don't read Greek, which I don't read Greek either, but you can also see what he is offering to Christ and to the Virgin. He has a model of Hagia Sophia. And you can see the great dome is really emphasized. And you can even see that buttressing shown here. So he's offering the Church of Hagia Sophia. Constantine is offering the city of Constantinople. So we have here this image of a walled city, which we see to represent cities. We've seen that before. If you think back to showing at Santa Maria Maggiore, the city of Jericho was shown as a walled city where you're looking down on little buildings within. And we're going to see this again, of course, in art as well. I might mention that the garments they're wearing are these very formal garments of the Byzantine emperor. And whether Constantine wore those or not, I have some doubts, but certainly they're showing him as the Byzantine emperor. The first Byzantine emperor is Constantine, and of course Justinian, the lawgiver and the patron of Hagia Sophia. Going on in time, in the early 12th century, we see an ex voto image. We think that some of these images where they show the emperor and the empress, that they probably refer to vows that have been made to Christ and to God. They're certainly showing them as though they were present with the holy personage. And the holy personage, you can see here, Christ is extending his blessing hand toward the Emperor John II Comenius, and the Empress is on the other side with some kind of rolled document. It looks like John has a sack. Is this his offering, perhaps, to the to Christ? I'm not sure. But once again, here we have the Virgin with Christ within her, the framework of her body. So that will remind you that she is the God-bearer, and she's contained the living body of Christ before he came into the world, visually, before he was manifest to human eyes. And here, of course, she's holding him here. Everybody is frontal. Everybody looks out at us, straight out. And of course, you see the patterning of the garments. These are very, very formal, stiff, bejeweled garments and richly decorated crowns that, of course, the Byzantine emperors wore. It was a very, very formal court. And this is, I think, a particularly elegant mosaic. It dates to a little later than the mid-13th century, about 1260, and it shows a diasis. A diasis is when Christ is between the Virgin Mary, who is on his right, and John the Baptist, who is on Christ's left. So Mary's on our left as we're looking at it, and John is on our right. This is an arrangement that is often seen, particularly in the West, in Last Judgments, but also, I think, in the East. And the idea is that at the Last Judgment, Christ will come in glory to judge the living and the dead, as the Creed says. And Mary, his mother, and John, his cousin, are the two chief intercessors, and they will plead for the souls of mankind. And we call this a diasis in the Eastern world. As we look at Christ in the diasis at Hagia Sophia, we see him represented as Pantocrator, or all-ruler, ruler of the universe. We see that the halo has a cross within it, the nimmed halo, and that refers both to his divinity, the halo itself, and then the cross reminds us of his sacrifice on the cross. He blesses with the one hand, and he holds a book, which we can only see part because part of it has been destroyed, but we can see the book, which would be the Bible, in his other hand. When you look at the style, you see that the hand and the face do seem to be modeled. When you stand back, you would see them as three-dimensional. But if you look at the drapery folds, the golden garment that he's wearing, his tunic, the drapery folds are completely lines. They are completely abstracted. And here we have a detail from another source showing close-ups of all three of these figures. I told you I was going to show you one image from the late Byzantine period. This is from the early 14th century, and we could say that Byzantine art continues right on into the 20th century because it is the art of the Eastern Orthodox Church. So Byzantine art is still being created today. But we'll stop with this one. We'll talk about more Byzantine artworks, but I think this is the latest one we're going to look at. This is also in Constantinople. It is from the Church of Christ in Kora, and it is from the apse of the Funerary Chapel. Now, this was a church that was converted into a mosque, so it's also known as the Hagia Sophia. And you can see there's several spellings of that. I learned it with the D, and your text refers to it with the C. So the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. This is a fresco. In other words, it is painted on wet plaster. First you'd have a layer of rough plaster, and then you would apply just enough plaster for what you can paint in a day, because it has to be wet. You'd mix up your ground pigments, your colors, and brush them on. And then they soak into the wet plaster, so what you're left with is a thin layer of colored plaster. And this lasts, of course, a lot longer than if you just had paint on the dry surface and it could just peel off. So that's one reason it has survived. So this is paint rather than mosaic, or painted plaster rather than mosaic. This is a type of resurrection. In the Byzantine Church, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, when you want to show a resurrection, you show the harrowing of hell. So this is called an anastasis, and anastasis just means resurrection. But the type of resurrection is known as either the harrowing of hell or the descent into limbo. Okay, let me explain that to you. From the Gospel of Nicodemus, I know probably most of you have never heard of the Gospel of Nicodemus. It is one of the Gospels that is considered to be apocryphal, such as the Gospel of St. James or the Proto-Evangelium, which tells the story of Mary's parents and then Mary and the childhood of Christ. And it's not part of the canonical Bible, but it was widely believed. In the same sense, this Gospel of Nicodemus is not part of the canonical Bible, but it is widely believed. And in it, it tells what happened to Christ during those 3 days when his body is in the tomb. He's dead, but he's not dead. You know, his body's dead, but what is his spirit doing, as it were? And what he does is go down to hell, or go down to the outer reaches of hell, which is called limbo. The outer reaches of hell are where people who are good people, where they are good people, they shouldn't suffer, but they are not allowed to enter into heaven because, for example, they lived before Christ. And so they couldn't be Christians. So and of course, remember, the belief is that only Christians could go to heaven. So Christ goes down into limbo, to the outer reaches of hell, and he rescues the just of the Old Testament. All of those people that you read about in the Old Testament, such as Adam and Eve, David and Solomon, Abraham and his sons, Isaac, Jacob. So there they are, all the prophets of the Old Testament. And you may notice there's one figure there, which we'll take a closer look at, John the Baptist. Now, John the Baptist was the cousin of Christ, but he lived before Christ made his ultimate sacrifice on the cross. So even John the Baptist is here. So let's take a look at the iconography. Well, first let me explain what happens in the Gospel of Nicodemus. It's a pretty exciting gospel, at least parts of it are, because you have all the devils sort of scurrying around and saying, he's coming, he's coming! Oh, bar the doors! And then Christ bursts through the doors. And if you look closely, you'll see below that there are two doors, these are the doors to hell that Christ has smashed open. And then sometimes you will see him, it's a little hard in this reproduction, but you see him treading on the devil, or the devil being bound in chains. But at any rate, there he is, walking right over the doors of hell themselves. He is in a mandorla, or almond-shaped body halo, which you can see here is adorned with stars. And he reaches out forcefully and grabs the wrists of Adam and Eve. They live to be old people, so they're not going to be showing in the nude as a young people. They're dressed, and it looks like they're sort of in coffins or sarcophagi, and they're being pulled out by Christ. So here is Christ. He's reached out forcefully. He's grabbing Adam. He's grabbing Eve, and he's pulling them out of what appear to be sarcophagi, bringing them back to everlasting life. And then on the other side, you see examples of the patriarchs and prophets of the Old Testament, some of whom we can identify. John the Baptist, for example, is standing there with a halo, and he's sort of right above and behind Abraham. And then overlapping John, you see one figure and another one next to him who would wear crowns. And these would be the two most famous kings of ancient Judea, ancient Israel, the kings David and Solomon. And on the others, and I can't really figure out which one is which, but you would have people like Abraham and Jacob and Isaac, and also the prophets of the ancient world, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Amos, Hosea. Start listing them. What's happening is Christ is going to rescue them, and he takes them to heaven. So if you say the Nicene Creed in the Eastern Church, there is a line that is not always included in the Western Church's recital of the Nicene Creed. See if I can do it. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only begotten Son, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, and was crucified, dead, and buried. And he descended into hell. And then, of course, it talks about the resurrection. The words, and he descended into hell, are not always included in the Nicene Creed when the Western Church says it. But this is how the Eastern Church shows the resurrection. We're going to talk about Middle Byzantine sculpture. And what we'll be doing is showing you just a few examples of ivories. One of the things you'll notice that these figures are often elongated. So it seems like they're stretched out, so they're tall and slender, that they have a small head in relationship to their body. It's sometimes suggested that this elongation suggests a spiritual realm, in keeping with Byzantine art. Here you have a coronation scene, and we sometimes have surviving ivories showing an emperor and his empress being crowned by Christ himself, and that's what you see here. This is the Emperor Romanus II, and I'm not sure how to pronounce his wife's name, Eudocia, at any rate, an emperor and an empress. This is from the mid-10th century, 945 to 949, which would correspond to the reign of the emperor. It is, of course, ivory, a very precious material, And once again, it shows the imperial authority conferred by Christ. Remember that Leo VI prostrated himself before Christ to receive the authority. Here, these emperors are standing up erect. The emperor and his empress are standing erect, and Christ is shown to have more authority because he's up on kind of a wonderful pedestal that's decorated. So he's higher up than they are in the hierarchy, and his hands go and touch them really directly. So he's really transmitting that authority. It's a very symmetrical image, same on both sides, and the elongation does give a sense of slender, graceful figures, as do the drapery folds that Christ's garment has. When you look very closely, you also see, of course, this pattern of the garments, which are supposed to show embroidered and jeweled garments, which we said in the Byzantine Empire, very stiff, very regal. And of course, that gives you the feeling that the bodies of the emperor and the empress are flattened in a sense. They seem stiff and perhaps otherworldly, or maybe just more very royal. One of the beautiful and intact ivory triptychs is the Harborville triptych. A triptych is a three-paneled altarpiece, or in this case, a three-paneled devotional image. You have the wider center, and then each of the sides is hinged, and it can be folded over, and of course it's half the width of the center, so it can be folded over like a little box. And in this case, because it's only 12 inches high, it could be taken with you. Because of the size, we're quite certain that this must have been used for personal devotion. A person could pray before it, and of course have their prayer ascend to the archetype, to Christ, or to any of the many saints that are portrayed here. In the top center, we see a deasis. We see Christ enthroned, and then on either side of him we see John the Baptist and the Virgin Mary. And of course, these would be the people who would intercede at the Last Judgment. You can see that they are elongated, very tall and slender. Christ's throne is quite splendid with a lot of detail. And of course, this is one of the ways I think that a lot of the Byzantine artists probably love to show their creativity was you have a certain type for Mary and Christ and John and everyone, but you can embellish the thrones. And here you see the row of saints. And basically you're just seeing a row of saints looking out at us. They all are labeled, so if we read Greek, we could tell which saint it was. And this idea of elongation continues into three-dimensional figures. These are also ivory, so they would have to be fairly small. The type of Madonna. You'll see Mary holding the Christ child, and she's gesturing toward him. She's calling your attention to the Christ child. This is called the Madonna or the Virgin Hogetiera. Hogetiera means she who shows the way. And Christ, of course, as the Bible says, is the way. He's the way to heaven. He's the way, the truth, and the light. And then, of course, we have these two very elongated saints on either side. And you'll notice that once again, Mary, she's the most important. Christ, of course, is even more important than her, but in between Mary and the two saints, she is more important, so she is the tallest. It's a way of drawing attention to her.